Okay, now back to another story making headlines today. New rules will make it easier for foreign interests to buy up Canadian companies. Industry Minister Christian Paradis unveiled these major changes with very little fanfare today. It means the threshold triggering a review of foreign investment triples from $330 million to $1 billion over a 4-year term. Do these changes attract more investment and boost the Canadian economy, or does this push to be open for business leave the door wide open to foreign takeovers? Joining me now in studio, Pierre Poilievre. He's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport. In Toronto is the NDP's Deputy Industry Critic, Dan Harris. And in Halifax, Liberal Industry Critic, Jeff Regan. It's still Constituent Week, so you're all spread across the country. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Pierre Poilievre, let's start with you. Why did your government decide to raise this threshold by such a huge amount right now?
Well, we start from the premise that foreign investment is a good thing. When people from abroad take their money and put it in our country to start or grow domestic Canadian firms, those firms then have to spend that money to hire people, to purchase equipment, and to expand the well-being of our local sectors. That's a good thing for our economy.
Were there particular requests from foreign companies saying, you know, $330 million, that's just not going to cut it. We need to have a much larger window here?
Not that I'm aware of, but keep in mind we have a $1.7 trillion economy. So $1 billion within the context of an economy that large requires certainty from foreign investors who are considering making investments in this country and want to reduce the uncertainty associated with a potential investment of that kind.
Okay, gentlemen, I'll get to you in a second, but let me ask you, Pierre Poilievre, what most critics point to when this sort of thing happens is the concern about how this affects Canadian companies. If you open the door to a threshold this big, what happens to Canadian companies? Is there a risk that they, are going to get squeezed out, or that they could be taken over? Are there no concerns there from the government?
Keep in mind, anybody who is selling an investment to a foreign buyer is doing so voluntarily. They can't be forced to sell their assets against their will. There's always a voluntary transaction. Nothing about today changes that. Canadians invest abroad, and people from abroad invest in Canada. We have in Canada about $670 billion invested in other countries, and other countries have about $600 billion invested in us. This is two-way commerce. It's part of creating jobs, exchanging capital in order to benefit people in and outside of Canada.
Okay, Dan Harris, the government has had many reports done on this and signaled that it was sort of headed in this direction in the last budget and is only now moving towards implementation. What are your concerns about increasing the threshold, and particularly by this much over 4 years?
Well, this is exactly the wrong direction that we wanted to see things headed with the Investment Canada Act, but it also doesn't deal with some critical issues. Industry, labor, and communities want to know what net benefit to Canada means. And these changes do absolutely nothing to address this. Mr. Regan and I can talk about this, and we've been trying to get the government to look at the Investment Canada Act and to do a study in the Industry Committee. And as of yet, we've been unsuccessful in getting the government
and Dan,
to
why is that important to know what the net benefit test is, or to make it clear?
That's for clarity for business and for communities and for employees. I mean, people coming to invest in Canada want to know exactly what the rules are, and of course communities don't want to be thrown up into upheaval when they don't know what's going to happen with their businesses. I mean, with Potash and McDonald Detweiler, in the end the government blocked those sales. But there was a lot of controversy and a lot of upheaval in those communities where people didn't know what was going to happen next. If we have clear rules, then people will have more predictability.
Okay, but if we have clearer rules, do you have any concerns about the threshold that was announced today, or that's okay that this has happened as long as they define those rules more clearly?
As I said right off the top, we think this is the wrong direction to be headed. We actually, in the NDP, wanted to see the threshold lowered. So that more companies would be subject to review, so that Canadians would actually know whether there's going to be a net benefit to Canada or not in these deals.
Okay, Jeff Regan, your perspective?
Well, Rosie, Pierre talked about the fact that companies looking at investing in Canada want certainty, and he's absolutely right that they do, but the government's not really giving them the certainty they're looking for, and that's why the investment community today is objecting to what they've heard, saying, where is the clarity that you've been promising on net benefit? In fact, back in 2010, when the government turned down the Potash Corporation sale, they promised to bring forward clarity, a clarification in terms of what net benefit means.
Yep.
A year ago, Minister Parody, the Minister of Industry, was actually calling for the industry committee to study this question and clarify this, and yet the Conservative Party's been blocking it.
Okay.
So, why isn't the government really interested in certainty for
Okay, well, let's get that to Pierre Poilievre. It is true that Tony Clement, when he was industry minister, did promise a clear definition of net benefit back in 2010. We've yet to see anything. Why is that?
Well, it's called Section 20 of the Act, in which there are 6 bullets that define what net benefit means.
He promised to offer more clarity around that, and Mr. Parody has said the same.
We look at the Act. The Act defines net benefit. It says there are 6 major defining points of net benefit. They include employment, the significance of an investment to Canadians and business, investment, the effect of the investment on productivity. Okay. I'm just quoting right out of the Act. They actually defined it, and I'm telling you it's right here in the Act. It's
but my point to you is that 2 cabinet ministers have said we will better clarify what it means. Is the government no longer committing to doing that?
Well, my view is that it's very clearly defined in the Act right now, and the net benefit of the country can be determined by the Canadian minister responsible based on the six points that are defined under Section 20 of the Act.
Okay, so that sounds to me, Dan Harris, like the government is happy with the definition that is there, and there's no intention of putting more details there.
Well, of course they're happy with it because it's purposely vague. And, of course, this, like many other issues we're dealing with in EI and immigration, this is putting all the eggs in the minister's basket. It's not actually giving parliamentarians or industry or the committee or anyone else a say in what that means. This puts the power into the minister's hands.
Okay, but Dan Harris, just to play devil's advocate here, what else has to be defined there out of the points that Pierre Poilievre raised? What else needs to be there that isn't there?
Well, more clarity on what actually net benefit means. And the NDP wants to see
more clarity on your
rules. Well, thanks for that, Pierre. Well, let's look at the Investment Canada Act, and let's look at some of the instances that have come forward. Electromotive diesel fell just under the previous threshold, and of course, in the end, that ended up having no net benefit to Canada. Let's look at U.S. Steel that the government's been involved in litigation with. They just closed their Hamilton smelter for the second time in the last 2 years. We want, and Canadians want, to have that clarity so that they know that those jobs are going to be there.
Pierre Poilievre, I'll let you respond. I'll let you respond in a second. Jeff Regan, why don't you get in there? I don't know if anyone could give me a clearer example of what exactly is missing from net benefit and why it needs to be there. Do you have one example of what it might be missing from there?
I think the point is that it's the government, in fact, that has promised. It said that clearly there needs to be more definition of this, more than those 6 points that Pierre talks about, and it hasn't offered that. And I think it's the kind of question that ought to be studied by the industry committee. We could have witnesses come forward who are involved in these kinds of businesses and these kinds of transactions and give us some suggestions about what could go in there. But, this government, as we see in the budget bill, wants to have all kinds of things change without any democratic process. And this is really part of the same story.
What does it mean?
And we can't even talk about what those things may or may not have come up at committee because the government keeps taking us in camera.
Okay, well, that's a completely different issue. Pierre Poilievre, I want to let Pierre Poilievre respond to some of those points.
Well, first, they keep telling us that something is missing from the 6 points that are in the Act, but they won't tell us what is missing. So they're the ones that need to tell us what problem exists before they tell us that we need to fix it.
Except you were the ones that promised to make the change. You were the ones that promised to make the change.
You've made that point already, and I've just shown you that there are 6 points in the Act, Section 20 of the Act. The second point is that the NDP raises the electromotive issue. That was not reviewable under the Act because it was not a foreign takeover. It was it was an asset that was owned by Americans that was purchased by a foreign company. And if I could just finish my point. And as a result, it would not have been reviewable under the existing rules regardless. So the other thing to point out is that without foreign investment in many of these enterprises, those jobs would not have existed in the first place. And if I could just point everyone's attention to what StatsCan said when it did a comprehensive study in 2011 of the nature of our economy, some of these foreign-controlled plants actually pay, on average, 30% more than domestically owned ones. There are real net benefits to having foreign investment, and we can't turn it away.
You made a lot of points there. Now my turn. Is this about opening the door to China, who is, for instance, looking at investing in oil sands development, pipeline development? Is this about allowing a bigger swath for China to come in and plunk a whole lot of money in here over the next 4 years?
China is one of many countries that would seek to invest in Canada. These changes are not made for any one country, other than Canada.
Dan Harris?
Yeah, Rosemary, I have to go back on the previous point because the Conservatives recently voted on an NDP motion after Electromotive that proposed public hearings as a mandatory part of the foreign investment reviews, consultation with those affected, public disclosure of the conditions attached to takeover approval, and transparent monitoring of corporate performance with enforceable penalties. And the Conservatives, in fact, voted for this in the House of Commons. You know, these are some common sense proposals from the NDP to actually make that system more transparent and to make it more accountable to Canadians.
Okay, Jeff Regan, your thoughts on specifically whether this is about promoting, investment from China, which, may or may not be what Canada should be doing. But do you think that that's exactly what the government is trying to target?
That's not clear to me, Rosie, but what I think is important here is that we ought to be having a discussion about questions like, should we in fact say that there are industries, not just individual companies, but sectors that are strategically important to Canada that we ought to be paying attention to under this, and that this threshold change shouldn't apply to, for example. So the question shouldn't just be, I think, about individual companies, but about sectors that are really important. And we might decide in a discussion that, yes, in fact, in relation to particular sectors, we want to make sure that those sectors take
Like what sector, for instance?
Well, look, that's the kind of discussion we want to have. Whether you want to talk about parts of the high-tech sector, things like obviously shipbuilding, where you need to have that capacity as a country, particularly if you need to build a navy in a hurry.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. So I'm not going to hold my breath for more clarity around the net benefit test. That's toast.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, all right, so that's
you
good.
You can hold your breath if you want. It is a free country.
Sounds like it's not going to happen. All right, thanks, gentlemen. We'll see you back here for you to get hard at work on Monday. Of course, you're here already, but the rest of them. Pierre Poilievre, Dan Harris, and Jeff Regan.